It can feel impossible to distinguish between reality and hype when it comes to new technologies. But that's exactly what strategic boards are doing, says Adam Bowen. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. This episode features Bowen, a managing director in the business consulting practice at Thornton, which is a financial supporter of NACD. He speaks with Dylan Sandlin, program manager of digital and cybersecurity content at NACD, about the board's role in tying digital transformation to strategy, how technology executives can work with the board, and how directors can stay current on new technologies. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Adam, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the BoardVision podcast. I want to kick off this conversation first by kind of setting the technology landscape and kind of seeing, compared to even just 2 or 3 years ago when ChatGPT hit the scene and really put the tech landscape and tech development on overdrive, what is different today than even a couple of years ago? And what should board members really be focusing on now in this new tech environment?
Not surprisingly, right, in the world that we live in today, things change quickly. And I think if we were having this conversation even a year ago, maybe even 18 months ago, I think one of the things that we would have been talking to and coaching board members on would be the notion of the possibility of AI. And I use that term or sort of emphasize that word possibility, and whether or not they should be asking questions about whether to invest in AI, right? Should the leadership team be looking at AI and thinking about that? And I think one of the dynamics of that framework was about FOMO, right? The fear of missing out and when can we lean in? I think the reality today is that it's changed. AI is already being used. Whether it's being governed in a certain way is a different question, but it's not so much about whether organizations should invest in AI. It's that they're already using it and they're thinking about that. And in many cases, what leads to a conversation like we're having today is that now we're getting into practical applications. And we're really starting trying to take a look at this from a very practical standpoint and trying to think about it in that way versus falling for some of the early hype.
And to kind of pull on the thread a little bit of, you mentioned FOMO, right? This fear of missing out. And, in conversations that I'm having, we're also hearing that there's an incredible focus on, yes, we see that others are making investments in technology and AI, and we want to make sure that we're not disrupted. And so if we can think about the investment decisions that are being made about technology and thinking about the disconnect that sometimes exists between, the push to maybe invest too quickly versus how does this investment actually tie to my organization's strategy? Can you talk a little bit about how board members can kind of evaluate some of these investment decisions to make sure that they're really bridging the gap between how the company is planning on investing in technology and what their strategic goals are?
One of the things that's inherent in that is to make sure from a board perspective that we have a clear understanding that leadership has a clear strategic roadmap. And I think that that's the starting point, right? Understanding where the business is, where the business is headed. And then from there, what are the gaps that we're trying to fill? Are we trying to fill an innovation gap? Are we trying to lower our cost to acquire? Are we trying to lower our SG&A costs? And depending upon what those specific business challenges are, that starts to then open the door to a particular technology conversation and helps us start to think about, if we're trying to lower our SG&A costs, then in what role could we use AI to try to understand how to improve the customer experience or to lower some of our marketing spend. So I think it starts, as you said, with the focus on the business challenge, on where some of the competitive headwinds that we might be facing are coming up. And then from there, starting to realign some of the technology enabling benefits that AI can start to bring to us.
So we've got the roadmap, right? So board members, they're looking at the roadmap. How are they best positioned to assess the success of any of these digital transformation or AI initiatives? And what are potentially some early warning signs or red flags that they should be aware of?
One of the challenges that boards need to be thinking about, right, is, as you said, they need to be looking out for red flags. And I think one of the things that they're specifically looking for in that space is really that there's an emphasis in the technology features over the business problems the technology is trying to solve for. In other words, there is a solution there that could be created, but it might be in search of a problem. And I think we've seen that in many cases. We often, the chatbots of the world tend to be kind of the butt of AI jokes in some circles. And while they can be highly efficient, and while they are certainly a symbol of the application of AI in some cases, the ability to be able to utilize and be able to recognize measurable improvements there is somewhat questionable. We need to start to think about not only what are the efficiency gains that we might be able to get, but also what are the assumptions that we have over usage? Do we have a clear understanding of our current state documentation so that when we are putting in metrics into place, that we can actually see the difference? We can see a measurable improvement in the application of the technology.
I know the focus on metrics there, and obviously that's a question that often comes up, which is, okay, how can we as board members ensure that we're receiving the right information about this initiative, right? We've undertaken this strategic initiative, we've invested in this technology. How can we make sure that the information that we're receiving from management is what we need? So in your experience, Adam, are there any reporting practices or specific governance structures that boards have implemented to ensure that they're best positioned to receive that information and act on it accordingly?
I think one of the things that we see in the world is that in many cases, the implementation roadmaps don't account for what we typically think of as organizational change or change management, meaning that they may document the implementation process and the organizational connectivity to that technology. But what they don't start to take into consideration is, what is the change management process? And how long is it going to take for people to actually establish these new behaviors? We've seen several different examples of these types of implementation processes where, even though the technology was implemented on time, even though the technology works, and we can talk about that because that's one of our key qualifying questions that we always coach on, does the technology work, right? Does it do, or is it outputting what we think it should do, right? Does it make sense? But we often see the technology does get implemented, but due to the lack of change management and coaching and communication around the technology, there's a level of skepticism around the answers or around the reports that are AI enabled. And I think that's part of the challenge as well, which is it's very difficult to measure something that people are thinking about and bringing a skeptical eye to. Goes back to this issue of behavior change, right? There's a technology change tied to these kinds of initiatives, but ultimately what I think boards need to be aware of is they need to be thinking about the true change, which is more about behavior.
I love your point there about a healthy skepticism and asking the right questions. And to kind of continue on that topic, do you have any additional questions that directors can ask, especially thinking about newer directors who, might be in this seat for the first time and they're receiving a briefing about, digital transformation initiative? What are some helpful questions that they can ask to kind of uncover some of these things we were talking about earlier, right? To bring that healthy skepticism to the conversation in a productive way.
You'll probably laugh at me, Dylan, but the first question that we always ask, or that we always coach leaders on, is the most basic question of all. Does it work? Does it do what it's supposed to do? And does it make sense when it is working? Oftentimes we apply that type of thinking to all strategic decisions, right? Can they be easily understood by a bright sixth grader? Does it make sense what we're trying to do? And do the outputs that we're getting, do those make sense? I think that's a useful starting point. I think a second question that we ask almost in the same breath is it fail safe? And what I mean by that is, does it fail in the off position? Is it generating something that is not going to do harm? One of the examples that I often like to refer to, and most people don't think of this technology as an AI, but when we think about cruise control in an automobile, one of the most basic forms of an artificial, I'm using air quotes here, technology, right, to help us. But when that cruise control fails, what happens? You just slow down. Nothing really happens. It fails safe. It fails in the off position. And what we want to make sure of is when we're evaluating technology, if it is going to do something that is going to throw in errors in a particular way, do we A, have the structure to identify what that is? And B, is it not going to do any harm? And I think that's another critical component that board members, or criteria that board members can apply when they're starting to evaluate these opportunities and when they're starting to see things that maybe they're not that familiar with. I don't think board members today, the win for them is not to be a technical expert, right? It's not their technical expertise that is being called upon. What's being called upon is their business judgment, right? They're not trying to be data scientists. They're focusing on the principles of governance. And so that notion of fail-safe is critically important to us. I think the third question that we often recommend considering is the notion of measurement. And we've talked a little bit about that, right? We need to think about usage metrics, right? Are people using this? What is it doing? How are we measuring this? And thinking about those types of metrics over, what are the features or what are the unique use cases that we're developing? A use case in the absence of utility is sort of a futile exercise. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to focus on that. So we often recommend this notion of measurement tied to business outcomes, right? Not technical capabilities. And so from that standpoint, I think those core questions, they just make a lot of sense to us. The other piece, and it's not really a core question, but I think it's just the notion of starting small. Think small and think strategically. And I think that's often the real win here, is because once we start to see an example of something that works rather well, then we can get on to scale, right? But the first thing that we really truly need to understand in an opportunity area is, what are the proof points, right? What are the things that demonstrate this solution is making good sense before we try to get out over our skis and scale too quickly or too fast?
I love that notion of starting small because, oftentimes, yes, that's where the true success really germinates, is in those really small experiments. But it also creates kind of a tension when you think about it from the board level, because, board members are supposed to be on the outside, right? Looking in, and they're not necessarily supposed to get their fingers in the weeds. And so, when you're thinking about the role of the board versus executive management, what really is the role of the board in overseeing digital transformation and not getting too deep into the weeds? And where can they really provide a lot of that business judgment and that value to the conversation from such a far off place?
Trying to identify areas for them to add value is critically important. It's not always clear. And I think an adjacent issue there is not only how to add value, but for whom to add value to, right? Because I think in many cases now, the types of job titles that they're going to be asked to interact with are going to evolve, and so there's going to probably become, if there isn't already one, there on the near-term horizon will be a chief AI officer. And there will want to be a relationship between that individual, or if that individual and the CIO are one and the same, but there'll want to be some sort of an understanding there with the board and how to interact with each other. And I think from that standpoint as well, I think that the watch out there is to speak in business impact language and not in technical speak, to be able to ask those questions and really sort of hold the team's feet to the fire with regards to business results. Also to think a little bit about user adoption. We talked earlier about change and behavior change and the management process to implement that, not just on the sophistication of the algorithm and not just on the technical terms of the implementation process.
I love that you brought up the chief AI officer. And I know in the fall issue of our Directorship magazine, we have a story that deals with this topic explicitly, right? The rise of the chief AI officers. In your experience, Adam, what are some of the common disconnects that you've seen between boards and C-suite executives when it comes to digital transformation? And where do you see there's room for improvement?
In many cases, we've actually seen less of a disconnect and more of a consensus between the executive team and the board, meaning that in many cases, they're in lockstep on strategy, and the AI and technology implementations are a layer to achieve that in a more efficient and a more effective way. So I would say from a disconnect standpoint, it's less prevalent from our standpoint than we think of. I think one of the things that we might see is we might see sort of this notion of, I don't know if it's the right term or not, but sort of AI theater being presented to the board, right? Where some of the use cases or some of the opportunities for implementation are brought, to leadership and are endorsed by leadership because they're a demonstration of movement in this space. But the reality is that there's not a whole lot of value that's being delivered. And I think that's a particular area that we do see disconnects, meaning that the board, because of their level of objectivity and because they're one step removed from the day-to-day operations of the business, they're able to see that a little bit further or a little bit more clearly. I think the other thing that often happens, and I think this is certainly where the board members add a lot of value, is they look and they have the ability to look and get information not just from the project management teams, themselves, but actually to get real anecdotal evidence from users, people that are focusing on that proof of concept to truly understand the value that it is adding. And in many cases, because they're one step removed, they're not always privy to that level of transparency. The other area that we often see a bit of a blind spot is with regards to this change management. It's not the super sexy part of the implementation process. So it's the board's job to have that as top of mind and to be able to reiterate that and make sure that the eagerness for time and delivery is not overstated, and they're looking for an appropriate timeline that's necessary for user training and really true adoption in the organization.
Adam, I love that you're talking about how the board can support change management within the organization, given that it's such a big part of these big digital transformation initiatives being successful in the long term. So I love that that's really part of this conversation we're having here. And one of the other things I want to touch on is you mentioned, where directors can go to get educated on these topics. And, obviously with any new emerging technology or trend, directors will need to have some continuous education on this topic to make sure that the oversight they're providing is effective and that it's appropriate. So in this new AI era, do you have any recommendations for how new or aspiring or, even long tenure directors can stay up to speed on what they need to know, and what is it really that directors do need to know about these emerging technologies in today's environment?
I think, Dylan, one of the things that we've seen is at Grant Thornton, we've tried to host smaller, more intimate roundtables where board members and practitioners can come together to ask, I don't know if they're uncomfortable questions or just more of the revealing questions about implementation and about strategy. What works, what doesn't work, and how's it working? How have we seen 12 months in on a particular technology implementation? How have we seen people adopt, and how have we seen the real benefits that we were promised at the start matriculate through the process? Are we achieving what we would have hoped to achieve? So I think attending those types of smaller practitioner-led group conversations is critically important. I think the NACD, and broader organizations like the NACD are doing a fantastic job of bringing together case studies. We're far enough down the road where we're starting to see sort of these peer director experiences coming to life in the format of a case study, so that not only is it reflective, it's reflective almost built in real time, right? It's reflective of where we are today, and they can study that. They can identify some of the patterns necessary to be able to see the kinds of things that they may be looking for in their own institutions. I think another area that is a great source of expertise is the industry trade associations. I think in many cases, when we think about AI, it's not just a conversation that's being had at the board and the leadership level, but it's very much being had at a practitioner level, and it's quite unique by industry. And I think, so taking the time to understand, if you're providing advice in financial services, the American Bankers Association, looking at HIMSS for healthcare, certainly in the manufacturing space, there are many industry-specific trade organizations that are looking at these kinds of solutions and trying to provide the type of guidance that's a little bit more specific or a little bit more germane to a particular aspects of an organization and the technology or the operational needs and the applications by industry.
You mentioned that you guys host roundtable discussions. Is that only executives, or is that with directors as well?
We do it with both.
Okay.
In fact, we did with our head of our life sciences industry, we actually hosted a board event in Boston where we had a combination of several industry leaders. We had an executive from Microsoft who was instrumental in the launch of Copilot and some of the Microsoft technologies. And we had board members. And so it was a conversation with practitioners, with technologists, and with board members. And it was done in an informal environment so that people could ask the kinds of questions that were either germane to their businesses that they were looking at, that they could get that type of clarification, or they could do that. What we oftentimes do is when we hear somebody describing a situation, you can see yourself in their situation. Your situation may be quite different. The application of AI may be quite different, but you're able to learn and pull a unique set of insights by hearing how it was applied in an adjacent area.
Adam, I want to pivot now to how technologies and new emerging technologies are shifting the balance between innovation and risk. Obviously, with any new technology, there comes with it a lot of new opportunities, but also some new additional risks that board members need to be aware of in their oversight. So in today's environment with the new AI technologies, obviously we have quantum in the news. Is that line shifting? And if so, have the new technologies that are in the environment today changed this risk versus innovation equation for board members?
I think one of the challenges that we've seen is that the evolution of these types of tools, what we typically looked at, and we had to make major technology decisions, let's say every 3 to 5 years, right? And we had some predictability to the upgrade cycles. I think that's gotten thrown completely out the window. Now we're seeing changes and updates, that are evolving monthly, not just on a yearly basis. That presents board members an opportunity to be able to evaluate and to change their evaluation processes. At the same time, I think that presents with them a potential headwind. There's a new risk, that competitor happens to launch a piece of technology, or let's say a new CRM system or a new AI-powered technique in their solution. And all of a sudden, they're able to capture your best customers, and that could completely transform your business in a much, much shorter time frame. So I think the amount of time that is taken to evaluate the evaluation cycle needs to be much more condensed and much more concise. I think there's also an opportunity to be able to think through what are the skill sets that need to be associated or need to be considered from an obsolescence standpoint that need to be updated to accommodate this pace of change. So I think it's not just a combination, or it's not just the technology itself that needs to be evaluated, but I think we also need to think a little bit about what are the things that we need to be thinking about from a workforce standpoint. How do we adapt our workforce to be able to keep up with the pace of technology and the pace of change?
And if we can bring it to the board level as well, what structures or processes do you believe the board members and boards themselves need to adapt or adopt to accommodate the pace of technological change?
One of the tools that we've often seen boards adopting is certainly a portfolio evaluation process, where rather than a point in time evaluation, they're actually looking at risk over a portfolio standpoint. So they're changing the resolution of their analysis, and they're starting to look at the role that technology could play across all lines of business, or not just in one particular aspect of that. We're also seeing boards recommend the creation of, I'm not sure if I would call it a rapid response teams, in order to be able to move at a faster pace and be able to run those types of analyses and make some adjustments in real time, so that they're not caught waiting, they're not caught on their back foot. The other piece that we're seeing a significant investment is obviously just in the governance processes themselves, and evaluating not only what use cases are being brought to the forefront, but also the necessary governance models to start to score and to evaluate the inherent risks in those specific use cases. The challenge there is the risk in the past was that, we were concerned about moving too slow. And I think the risk today is that we're concerned about moving too fast. So we really need to sort of think about what is that balanced approach so that we can prevent mistakes, but at the same time, not miss opportunities as they present themselves to us.
Yeah, and that gets back to the earlier discussion, right, about looking at those early warning signs, having that healthy skepticism in the conversations you're having.
I like the way you said that, Dylan, because I think when it comes from a board perspective, I do actually think that part of the job of the board isn't necessarily to prevent those technology mistakes. They're the board, and I don't know that that's necessarily a key aspect of their role, but I do think that it is critical for them to encourage the creation of systems that help the organization learn quickly from those inevitable mistakes, right? Because that is the way in which you build a competitive advantage. And so it's not just being able to make the right calls and the right choices with regards to the technology, but it's being able to help the organization, work at a learning speed, and operate in that way as well.
Yeah, it gets back to one of the recommendations we make in our Blue Ribbon Commission report from 2024 about technology governance, right? The biggest risk oftentimes is not necessarily taking a risk when it comes to technology, right? Like, you have to be willing to engage with these new technologies to, like you said, develop a competitive advantage that creates value over the long term for the business. It's a very healthy tension that needs to be brought to these discussions. But again, that's the role of the board. Well, Adam, as we pivot away kind of from the specific structures, I want to kind of end this conversation with what are the future trends that board members should be looking at or evaluating when it comes to technologies that are coming down the pike?
One area that I spend a lot of time looking at is the implementation of AI in the front office environment. Typically, when boards are thinking about and have been asked to think about it, in many cases, AI has been utilized from a product development standpoint and even from a supply chain and efficiency standpoint as well. Nowadays, in the SG&A space, we're seeing a huge opportunity from the front office standpoint. We're seeing the ability to utilize this type of technology to improve our sales forecasting. We're able to get much clearer and much more reliable forecasts on budget realities. We're able to start to understand much more clearly in an SG&A environment who's selling, why are they selling, why are customers buying, and what that overall customer experience and the improvement in that space is able to look like. We're seeing a lot of things related to that or that organizations are doing to enable that shift, certainly moving away from third-party to first-party data and thinking around the role of expansive data availability and using that to improve customer experience, to be able to improve customer success, and to be able to disintermediate the challenges around customer problem solving in really effective and efficient ways. I think we're going to start to see that piece of it is going to be critically important. I think we're also starting to see, especially in the healthcare and life science space, the ability to focus on and have clearer and more efficient ways to think about the regulatory environment and the impact of the regulatory environment on their businesses is another critically important area. I think there's one of the things that we'll start to see again, and I touched upon it a moment ago with regards to innovation, is really the trying to mine your data, right? Once you've got the plumbing correct, once you've actually been able to scale up your data and connect it in meaningful ways, you've increased the resolution of analysis, you're able to see more, then you're able to start to identify where those opportunities are and use that data as a competitive moat and be able to start to utilize and harness the power of AI to identify new opportunities, new competitive advantages, and utilize those techniques and technologies to differentiate yourself in the marketplace.
Appreciate that overview of what's coming down the pike in 2026, Adam. Are there any final thoughts or final recommendations that you'd like to give to board members who might be listening?
One recommendation that I would have is not to fall prey. I think we often will do this, to fall prey to a specific technology, that it's a silver bullet or it's a particular game changer. I think that the thing for us to think about instead is that it's really about the pace of the technology and the technology development that we need to keep an eye on. We've talked about that a little bit today, right? It's really building the operating models. It's building the governance models that allow us to work at this new pace, this new pace that the world is operating in, that we have to be able to be more nimble, that we're working at learning speed, and we're being able to adopt technologies into our business and adopt our business model to meet the needs of the market. I think that's one of the biggest things that board members can really truly focus on today.
Well, Adam, really appreciate you joining us today for the conversation. Really enjoyed it. I hope that all the listeners as well have something to take away from this. Adam, again, really appreciate you joining the conversation. I learned a lot, so I hope you had fun.
I had a lot of fun, Dylan. It was great talking to you today. Thank you so much.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.